Welcome back, everyone, and thank you for joining me again. Today's story is one of the most shocking yet least known disasters in human history. Imagine a wall of water taller than a skyscraper, racing across the land at more than 30 miles an hour, wiping out entire villages in minutes. Imagine millions trapped, hungry, desperate, while the world outside never even knew it happened. This isn't fiction. This is the true story of the Banqiao Dam disaster of 1975, a tragedy so vast, so hidden, it claimed more lives than Chernobyl, the Titanic and the Hindenburg combined, and yet most people have never heard of it. Let's uncover the story that was buried beneath the waters for decades. Night fell over Henan province in central China like a suffocating blanket, heavy with storm clouds that had refused to part for days. For nearly a week, rain had lashed down without pause, an unrelenting torrent driven inland by the fury of Typhoon Henan. Rivers overflowed, crops drowned, and the soil itself seemed to groan under the weight of water. To the people in the small villages downstream of the Banqiao Dam, the storm was frightening but not unprecedented. Floods were a fact of life in this part of China. What they could not know was that high above them, the dam that was supposed to protect them was straining under pressures it was never designed to withstand. Inside the Banqiao control station, weary workers monitored gauges that spun into uncharted territory. The reservoir had swollen far beyond safety limits. For hours, operators telegraphed frantic pleas for permission to open the sluice gates further, to release more water before the pressure became unbearable. Orders came back from higher authorities: hold the water, protect the fields downstream, do not flood the harvest. Politics spoke louder than engineering warnings, and in that silence, death gathered momentum. Shortly after midnight on August 8, 1975, the earth shook with a sound unlike thunder. A deafening crack ripped through the storm as the Banqiao Dam, a massive wall of concrete and earth, once hailed as an engineering triumph, it gave way. In the black of night, a wall of water nearly 10 meters high exploded from the broken dam, racing into the valleys below at speeds faster than a car could drive. Entire villages vanished in minutes. Families asleep in their beds were swept away before they could open their eyes. Roads dissolved, bridges disappeared. Where once there were fields of rice and corn, now there was only a churning inland sea. It was not just Banqiao. One dam breaking triggered another, and then another. In all, more than 60 dams across Henan collapsed that night, unleashing a cascade of destruction no living soul could stop. By dawn, the map of central China had been rewritten in water and mud. The flood was only the beginning. In the days that followed, millions were left stranded on shrinking islands of dry ground, surrounded by stagnant floodwaters filled with corpses of animals and humans alike. Food spoiled, clean water vanished, and disease spread as relentlessly as the storm that had unleashed it all. The official death toll given decades later was around 26,000 lives lost to the immediate floods, with another 100,000 claimed by famine and disease in the weeks that followed. But survivors, researchers and independent studies whisper a darker truth. The number may have been far higher, closer to 200,000 or more, making it one of the deadliest engineering disasters in human history. And yet, outside China, almost no one knew. For years, the Banqiao Dam disaster was buried under silence, hidden by censorship, erased from newspapers and history books. While the world remembered Chernobyl, Bhopal and Titanic, Banqiao became a tragedy endured by millions but spoken of by almost none. This is the story of the night the dam broke, of the storm that pushed an already fragile system beyond breaking, of the people who paid the price for human arrogance and political pride, and of how one of the greatest man-made disasters of the 20th century was almost forgotten. To understand the scale of what happened in 1975, one has to go back to the early years of the People's Republic of China, when the idea of taming water was deeply tied to politics, ideology, and the future of the nation itself. Floods had haunted China for millennia. The Yellow River was nicknamed China's Sorrow for its devastating floods that routinely killed tens of thousands. In the late 1940s and 1950s, as Mao Zedong consolidated his new government, controlling nature became a central theme. The Communist Party spoke often of conquering mountains and rivers. Giant dams would not only prevent floods but also generate electricity, irrigate fields, and serve as monuments to progress. The Banqiao Dam, built on the Ru River in Henan province, was part of this vision. Construction began in the early 1950s with Soviet technical support. It was designed as both a flood control measure and a hydroelectric project. At first, the dam was a source of immense national pride. Engineers celebrated it as proof that the new China could master science and engineering on a grand scale, but the context in which Banqiao was built carried risks from the start. China was rushing to industrialise under Mao's leadership, and speed often took precedence over safety. The Great Leap Forward, launched in 1958, demanded monumental infrastructure projects built as quickly as possible. Engineers were often forced to cut corners, and warnings about design flaws or insufficient materials were dismissed as pessimism or worse, political disloyalty. Banqiao itself had been built using Soviet specifications with a design intended to withstand what was called a 1,000-year flood, but Chinese engineers had quietly noted problems. They worried that the dam's spillways were too narrow, that its sluice gates might not be able to handle extreme volumes of water. Some even argued for redesigning the dam to withstand a 10,000-year flood. These concerns were filed away, politely ignored in the rush to present a shining achievement. The surrounding regions soon became laced with additional dams, more than 60 in total, turning Henan province into a showcase of Mao's dream of conquering rivers. Each dam was meant to protect the land, feed the people, and secure the future. On paper, the system looked invincible, but in reality, it was fragile. Many of the smaller dams were built with local labour, poor materials, and little oversight. They stood like dominoes, one dependent on the strength of the next. Meanwhile, politics shaped every engineering decision. Mao's insistence on controlling floods and producing more food led to orders that dams should hold water whenever possible, even if safety dictated otherwise. Agriculture came first. Protecting crops was seen as protecting the revolution itself. If water was released preemptively to ease pressure, villages downstream might flood, and no local official wanted to explain ruined harvests to Beijing. By the late 1960s, Banqiao had already shown signs of stress. Cracks appeared, repairs were made, reinforcements were added, but still, the underlying weaknesses were never truly addressed. Engineers quietly filed reports warning of danger, yet in a political climate where speaking out could end a career, or worse, few dared to push harder. So Banqiao remained standing, towering over the Ru River, seen by villagers below as both protector and potential threat. Life went on. Children played in the fields, unaware that a man-made catastrophe was waiting for the right storm to arrive. That storm came in the summer of 1975. The summer of 1975 had already been a season of uneasy skies across southern China. Rainfall was heavier than usual, rivers were swollen, and fields were waterlogged. Farmers in Henan province were used to floods, but few could imagine what was brewing far out in the Pacific Ocean that July. On July the 29th, 1975, a tropical disturbance began forming east of the Philippines. Within 2 days, it had strengthened into Typhoon Nina, the 12th storm of the Pacific season. By the time it passed the northern Philippines, it had grown into a powerful Category 4 storm, with winds howling at over 200 kilometers per hour. Yet it was not just wind that made Nina deadly. What sealed its fate as a historic storm was how it interacted with weather systems over China. As Nina tracked northwest, it began colliding with a cold front moving southward from Siberia. At the same time, a high-pressure system parked itself north of the Yangtze River, blocking Nina's natural escape route. Instead of veering back out to sea, the typhoon stalled, pinned in place over central China. This stalling was catastrophic. For 3 days, Nina hovered above Henan and Hubei provinces, dumping an astonishing amount of rain. Weather stations recorded totals that defied belief, more than 1,600 millimeters in just 3 days in some places. To put this in perspective, Henan normally received less than 1,000 millimeters of rainfall in an entire year. The deluge overwhelmed everything. Villages were submerged, roads disappeared. The usually calm rivers swelled into raging torrents. Farmers watched in despair as their rice paddies and wheat fields drowned under brown floodwaters. At the Banqiao Dam, engineers grew increasingly alarmed. The dam was designed to withstand what officials had proudly called a 1,000-year flood, but the rainfall now pounding the region far exceeded that benchmark. Each hour, the reservoir climbed higher. The spillways, the channels meant to release excess water, were woefully undersized for such a torrent. The engineers ordered more water released, but the sheer volume was impossible to control. Worse still, politics again intervened. Orders from higher authorities instructed dam managers to retain as much water as possible to protect downstream farmland. Letting water out could mean flooding villages, ruining crops, and angering officials. But keeping water in meant piling pressure on Banqiao itself. It was a devil's choice, and the dam's walls bore the weight of it. Meanwhile, the rain showed no sign of stopping. Entire hillsides collapsed in landslides. Communication lines snapped. Villages were cut off, isolated in seas of water. The people of Henan huddled in their homes, unaware that their lives now depended on whether Banqiao and the dozens of other dams across the region could withstand a storm no one had imagined possible. In those desperate hours, engineers at Banqiao sent telegrams pleading for permission to release more water. Some of the messages were never answered. Disrupted lines meant that cries for help simply vanished into static. Others were delayed or bogged down in bureaucratic chains. By the time approvals came, it was already too late. The reservoir was rising at a pace no spillway could handle. By the night of August 7th, 1975, Banqiao Dam was facing its greatest test. Exhausted engineers monitored gauges, listened to the roar of water hammering against the walls, and prayed that the structure would hold until the storm passed. But Typhoon Henan had no intention of easing. The rain intensified, as if nature itself was determined to push Banqiao past its breaking point. The stage was set. Within hours, one of the deadliest engineering disasters in history would begin. The night of August 7th, 1975 was suffocatingly dark. Clouds from Typhoon Henan hung low over Henan, blotting out the moon and stars. Sheets of rain hammered the land, turning roads into rivers and fields into lakes. Inside the Banqiao Dam's control room, a skeleton crew of engineers stood watch, their faces drawn and pale under flickering electric lights. All day, they had been fighting a losing battle. The reservoir level rose relentlessly, metre by metre. By evening, it had surpassed the dam's design capacity. The spillways thundered at full force, yet the incoming torrents dwarfed what could be released. The roar of rushing water outside was so loud it made the windows rattle. At 11 p.m, instruments showed the reservoir was climbing dangerously close to the crest. The engineers knew the numbers too well. If water overtopped the dam, the structure would not survive. A desperate telegram was drafted. The situation is critical. Request immediate permission to release maximum water. Failure to act will risk dam failure, but communication lines were intermittent. The storm had crippled telegraph poles and drowned relay stations. Many pleas never left the dam. Those that did reached provincial authorities hours later. By then, events were already beyond human control. By 1 a.m. on August 8th, the water was lapping just beneath the top of Banqiao's wall. The engineers outside, working in raincoats soaked through to the skin, could barely see through the downpour. Searchlights illuminated the angry brown waves slamming into the dam's face. Suddenly, a terrifying sound pierced through the storm, a deep, resonant crack, like a cannon shot echoing through the valley. The ground trembled. Another crack followed, then another, as if the dam itself were groaning in agony. The wall was fracturing. At 1:30 a.m, Banqiao gave way. The central section of the dam crumbled, and in an instant a wall of water over 6 meters high burst through the breach. The roar was unlike anything human ears were meant to hear. A deafening thunder as 700 million cubic meters of water exploded out of the reservoir. To put that into perspective, it was as if the entire volume of Niagara Falls over 24 hours had been released in just a few hours. Downstream, sleeping villages had no warning. People were ripped from their beds as the flood swept through homes with the force of a hurricane. Entire houses were smashed to splinters. Oxen, carts and trees were tossed like toys. Survivors later described the flood not as water, but as a black wall moving faster than a galloping horse, devouring everything in its path. The waves surged forward at nearly 50 kilometers per hour. Within minutes, it engulfed the first villages along the Ru River basin. The screams of families trying to cling to rooftops and treetops were swallowed by the relentless roar of water. Darkness made escape impossible. Even if someone woke at the first sound, there was nowhere to run. One witness, who miraculously survived by clinging to a large tree, recalled, "It was like the end of the world. The river rose above our heads and people vanished. We did not even have time to cry out." Banqiao's failure set off a deadly domino effect. Dozens of smaller dams downstream, already weakened by Nina's rains, were unable to withstand the sudden deluge. 62 dams collapsed in total, compounding the destruction. By dawn, what had been fertile farmland and bustling villages was now an inland sea, stretching as far as the eye could see. Rescue was impossible in those first hours. The flood had destroyed bridges, roads, and telegraph lines. Entire communities had simply disappeared, erased in the darkness. In less than one night, Banqiao had unleashed one of the deadliest floods in recorded history. But for the survivors clinging to rooftops or floating on makeshift rafts, the true nightmare was only beginning. When the first light of dawn broke over Henan on August 8, 1975, it revealed a scene from a nightmare, where villages once stood. Only rooftops poked through an endless expanse of muddy water. The flood had carved a path more than 50 kilometres wide and hundreds long, swallowing fields, railways, and entire towns. An estimated 6 million people were trapped in this drowned world. Some clung to treetops, refusing to let go even as their hands blistered. Others balanced precariously on fragments of collapsed houses or floated on hastily lashed together rafts of doors and bamboo poles. The lucky few who reached slightly higher ground found themselves marooned on tiny islands surrounded by an ocean of death. With homes destroyed, food supplies washed away, and crops annihilated, the survivors faced hunger almost immediately. The floodwater was thick with mud, debris, and the corpses of humans and animals alike. Drinking it meant disease. But thirst left few alternatives. Some survivors strained floodwater through clothing, hoping to make it less deadly, while others drank straight from the foul torrent, unable to resist dehydration. In the days following the collapse, cholera, dysentery, and typhoid began to spread. Doctors who might have treated these outbreaks were themselves either drowned, stranded, or cut off without medicine. Children cried from hunger, while mothers tried to soothe them with nothing more than handfuls of raw corn salvaged from muddy fields. Livestock that survived wandered aimlessly, too weak to stand after days without fodder. The smell of death clung to everything, carried by humid August air. Eyewitnesses spoke of heartbreaking scenes. A farmer carrying his elderly mother on his back, trudging chest deep in floodwater, refusing to abandon her even as his strength gave out. Children found alive days later, floating inside wooden barrels, placed there by parents who themselves had perished. Entire families huddled on rooftops, waving desperately at aircraft that passed overhead, knowing rescue could not yet reach them. For many, the days after the flood were worse than the night of the collapse itself. The shock of survival gave way to the agony of slow starvation. In some villages, people tore bark from trees and boiled grass in dirty water, trying to trick their stomachs into feeling full. Rescue was agonizingly slow. Roads and railways had been washed away, bridges lay in twisted ruins, telecommunication lines were down, meaning even the scale of the disaster remained unknown to Beijing for precious days. Many villages waited over a week before relief boats or helicopters arrived. In the meantime, isolation ruled. Survivors signalled with bonfires at night, hoping the glow might be seen. Some carved messages into pieces of wood and let them float downstream, pleas for help that might by chance be found. The flood had created not just physical separation, but psychological torment. People could see their neighbours across the water, close enough to shout, but could not reach them. Whole families split apart in the chaos, were forced to wonder if loved ones were alive or gone forever. By the time the waters receded weeks later, the official death toll was staggering. Tens of thousands had drowned in the first hours, but the greater tragedy came after. Famine, disease, and exposure claimed hundreds of thousands more. Modern estimates suggest the total number of lives lost may have exceeded 230,000, though secrecy and censorship in the years that followed obscured the true scale. One survivor summed it up with haunting words: "We did not fear dying that first night. We feared the days after, when death came slower and no one knew we were still alive." When the floodwaters of the Banqiao Dam finally began to retreat in late August 1975, they left behind a desolate plain of mud, wreckage, and unimaginable loss. Villages had been reduced to nothing more than muddy outlines of foundations. Crops, once lush and ready for harvest, had vanished. The survivors, gaunt and weakened, stumbled out of their temporary islands to confront a world forever changed. What emerged in the days that followed was staggering. 62 dams in the region had collapsed in a domino effect triggered by Banqiao's failure. Together, they had released a flood equivalent to several times the volume of Lake Mead. The destruction stretched across 30 counties, wiping out nearly 10 million acres of farmland and destroying more than 5 million homes. For the government, the catastrophe posed a dual challenge: relief for the victims and control of the story itself. Relief teams began arriving in force once the waters lowered enough to allow access. The People's Liberation Army, PLA, mobilised 200,000 soldiers to rescue survivors, deliver food and restore order. They built makeshift bridges, ferried rice and flour by helicopter, and erected tents on dry patches of ground. But the task was overwhelming. Millions were displaced and supplies were thin. Food rationing led to long lines at aid stations, where a family might receive only a few handfuls of grain for the week. Medicine was scarcer still. For many, the PLA's arrival was too late. Disease had already taken hold. Entire villages were buried without ceremony. The dead counted in silence. Perhaps the most chilling element of the Banqiao disaster was not just its human toll, but its deliberate concealment. The Chinese government, concerned about international reputation and internal dissent, quickly classified the tragedy as a state secret. Official newspapers at the time barely mentioned the dam failure, framing it only as severe flooding in Henan province. Numbers were manipulated and details were erased. For decades, families who lost everything were unable to openly speak about what happened. Even survivors were pressured into silence, their testimonies hidden until the 1990s, when limited information began to surface. In 1975, China was still in the throes of the Cultural Revolution. Political campaigns prioritised loyalty over truth, and engineers who had once warned about Banqiao's vulnerability had already been silenced or dismissed. To admit that poor planning, faulty design, or ignored warnings had contributed to the catastrophe would have been to admit weakness, something the state refused to do, so the narrative shifted. The collapse was blamed on an extraordinary act of nature, a once-in-2,000-year storm, rather than systemic failures. In the official telling, the people of Henan became victims of weather, not policy. Outside China, the world heard little. International journalists were barred from the disaster zone, and foreign governments were given only vague reports of flooding. For decades, Banqiao remained an invisible tragedy, unknown to all but those who lived through it. It wasn't until the 1990s, after government documents were quietly declassified, that researchers began piecing together the true scope of the event. Even today, it remains one of the least known yet deadliest disasters in human history. One survivor recalled many years later, "We thought the world would come to help us, but we realised no one even knew." The Banqiao Dam disaster of 1975 was more than a tragedy of engineering, it was a tragedy of memory. For decades, the people of Henan carried scars that few outside their province even knew existed. Families who had lost parents, children, entire villages grew old in silence, unable to share their grief with the wider world. Historians now estimate that between 170,000 and 230,000 people may have died as a result of the collapse, from the initial flood, from hunger, and from the epidemics that followed. This would make Banqiao one of the deadliest technological disasters in human history, yet it rarely appears in lists alongside Chernobyl, Bhopal, or even the Titanic. For those who lived through it, the memories remain vivid. One farmer recalled watching his entire village disappear in the space of a few minutes, the earth trembling as the waves swallowed houses whole. Another survivor remembered climbing into the branches of a tree and staying there for 3 days, surrounded by floating corpses. And then there were the orphans. Tens of thousands of children were left without parents, many raised by relatives or in state institutions. To this day, older survivors say they can still hear the cries in the night, children calling for mothers and fathers who would never return. The silence that followed was as heavy as the flood itself. For years, survivors commemorated their dead privately, with small ceremonies or whispered prayers. No monuments were built, no songs were written. The story of Banqiao faded from China's official memory. It wasn't until 1993, when a report quietly surfaced in Chinese state media, that the outside world began to learn the truth. Even then, details were fragmentary and estimates varied wildly. International scholars, piecing together survivor accounts, declassified documents and engineering reports, slowly reconstructed the disaster. Only then did the world understand the full magnitude of what had happened in Henan that August. Banqiao is a reminder of the delicate balance between human ambition and nature's power. Dams represent progress, control, and security, but when mismanaged, they can unleash destruction greater than the forces they were built to contain. It is also a reminder of the cost of secrecy. Had the warnings of engineers been heeded, or had the disaster been openly studied and remembered, thousands of lives might have been saved, both then and in later disasters around the world. Silence, in Banqiao's case, was as deadly as the flood itself. Today, few visitors come to the plains of Henan seeking traces of the flood. Villages have been rebuilt, fields replanted, and life has moved on. But in quiet corners, aging survivors still light candles, still whisper names of the lost, still remember the night the water came. The Banqiao Dam disaster may never receive the global recognition of other tragedies, but for those who lived through it, its memory endures, a hidden chapter of history as vast and unstoppable as the wave that changed their world forever. And that was the hidden history of the Banqiao Dam disaster, a catastrophe of silence, secrecy, and unimaginable loss. Thank you so much for watching and supporting this channel. If you found this story as powerful as I did, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss what's coming next. There are many more untold stories waiting, tragedies, triumphs, and mysteries from the past that will change the way you see history. I can't wait to share the next one with you. Until then, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next video.